Good evening. Tonight we are going to continue a lesson that began the first week of March, I believe, and we were interrupted after 2 lessons. This was the class on creation versus evolution. For this class, what I would like to do is to review the first 2 lessons that we did back then. If you were not able to be present for those 2 classes, I would suggest that you would look at the links in the comments go back and look at those videos. They will have a lot more detail than I'll be going into tonight. But if you were there for those videos and would like to just be refreshed, that's what this class is going to be tonight. So, if we look at our source text, Psalms chapter 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. We see the evidence of the existence of God and his glory all around us. But there are attempts to erode away at faith, at the idea of the existence of God through evolution. And evolution is being spread all over. And as Christians, I believe we have a responsibility to defend the faith, and to understand and to defeat false doctrines that would go to try to discredit the faith in God. So, as way of review, I wanted to talk about why this is important. Now, again, in the first 2 lessons, if you go to review those, we do have more detail. I would very much recommend that you look at these verses. I think there's a lot of good content there. But just as a way of summary, why I believe this is important. First, non-belief is surging. When I was in college and the environment that I was in, I saw a lot of disbelief and a lot of challenge to the idea of the existence of God. Our children have to deal with this quite a bit in school, and we have a responsibility to defend the faith to them. But this is everywhere, and it's growing, and I think it's a responsibility for us to recognize that and to do something about it. We need to defend a challenge to our own faith. There's a chance that if you get in a conversation with someone and they present to you evidence or arguments that could cause you to waver in your faith and cause doubt. And so I believe it's important to study this to reaffirm, to reestablish our faith in the existence of God and his glory, and to understand the opposite perspective and the arguments so that we do not falter in our faith. Again, as I mentioned, to help guard our children, because they're going to be confronted with this, and we need to be able to instruct them in why things that are incorrect, not just why the principles of the Bible are correct, but also why something that is incorrect, why something that is false doctrine is in fact false. We need to understand that. Also, we do not want to discredit our message with ignorance. So, if we ignore or completely dismiss something that has some truth in it, then we're going to discredit ourselves. And our goal, of course, is to spread the gospel and to reach others for Christ. But if we discredit ourselves by our own ignorance, then it will make that more difficult. Our faith is being attacked, and we have the charge to defend the faith, to stand up against false doctrine. They are spreading this to the detriment of lost souls all around the world, and we have a responsibility to defend the faith against this. So again, just a little bit about my approach. I believe that it is important not only to know the principles of why I believe what I believe, but I should know and understand the principles of false doctrine in order to defeat it. If I don't understand the false doctrine, I cannot defeat that false doctrine. So it's important for us to understand our enemy as well as ourselves, as you see in that quote here from The Art of War. So we're going to break down the theory of evolution and the associated evidence and look at it in pieces and parts and try to discern what parts are true and what parts are false. We're going to describe common points of debate, and we're going to try to understand the arguments we will periodically stop and have to learn some scientific mechanisms. So we have a lot of illustrations and pictures when it comes to that to try to help illustrate these points. But we're going to have to learn a little bit of science in order to understand the basis behind the idea of evolution in order to discern what is true from what is false. And I would recommend that or request that if you're watching these videos to leave comments in the comments area or questions in the comments area. I will look through these, and as the last class, I will try to address these questions, and it'll give me some time to look into and to research these questions to make sure that I can come up with a good answer, and I'll do that as the final class. So, some of the important theological arguments that we need to consider, and these are arguments, theological arguments for the existence of God. Of course, the best evidence for the existence of God is in the Bible and just viewing creation around us. However, those who work in the field of deep thought and theological concepts, they have come up with these ideas that are used to defend the idea of the existence of God. And these include, first, the Cosmological Argument, and this is better known as cause and effect. And more specifically, a material effect requires an adequate cause. The teleological, which is better known as intelligent design, suggests that design requires a designer. The anthropomorphic, the idea of the Goldilocks universe, the idea that everything is finely tuned for life, and if anything was a little off, then life couldn't exist. So the idea of that level of complexity and happened to be so finely tuned to support life as evidence for the existence of God. The moral argument, which suggests that objective morality is not a natural thing, it has to be supernatural. And then finally, the ontological argument that God must exist in order to be conceived. Now, from the opposite point of view, we are going to break down the idea of evolution. What is evolution? Well, to begin with, by definition, evolution is a very simple concept. It is the change in allele frequency over time. So we'd have to break down, well, what's an allele? And again, we're going into more detail in the previous lessons. I would suggest that you look back at those, but we can think of those as variations of our individual genes. So the genes that make you tall or short, or blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, the type of hair you have, all things about your appearance, our biology are determined by these genes, and these genes come in pairs. And so these, you can have, out of those two pairs, you can have one gene of this variation and the other gene of this variation. And that variation can change as you have children and pass those genes along. So the fact that genes, genetic variation, the frequency of these in a population can change over time is the original and basic definition of evolution. And it is interesting to note that in its definition is absolutely true. This does happen. There is change in frequency of our genetics over time. So that, for someone in a religious setting, that can be jarring, but we do need to discern what is true from what is false. And this part is actually true. And it is a concept that we can see even in God's Word play out. However, the ideas that stem from this, extrapolations, a mathematical term which is to take something way beyond its reasonable conclusion, extrapolations of this idea are where we run into trouble. So, also I wanted to take note of a picture to the top right. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is a picture from the Hubble telescope, a deep field, long exposure of the night sky. Now what they did here is they found the darkest part of the sky away from all the stars as much as they could be in the darkest part of the sky. And they took a long time exposure, deep field exposure, and this is what they saw. Now, this is just amazes me as to showing the glory of God. When we think of the heavens declare the glory of God, think for a moment that all the stars that we see in the night sky, in the darkest night, at the highest elevation we can get, all the stars that we can see, those are just the stars in our Milky Way. And we don't even see all the stars in our own galaxy. Matter of fact, we don't see all the stars in the night sky because, the other side of the earth, you can see different stars. So you can say maybe a quarter of the stars you can see visibly from Earth on the darkest night is all you're going to see at any time, but they're plentiful, they're everywhere. Millions of these stars. And that's just a portion of our own galaxy. Now, when they took this picture from the Hubble telescope, these that you are seeing, every point of light in this picture is not a star, they are individual galaxies. Galaxies just as vast as our galaxy. You can see some of them are spiral shaped and some are round, and there's different variations. But each one of these galaxies represents something just as vast or even more vast than everything that we can see in the night sky. It's amazing. All these stars could possibly have planets of their own. Just the complexity and the amazing vastness of our universe is just amazing. And it does certainly show the glory of God and the magnificence of His creation. So when we're breaking down evolution, that's just kind of a side note. We'll come back to visit that concept from that picture later. But to break down evolution beyond its definition, so in its subgroups, we have cosmological evolution, which is the origin of matter, also known as the Big Bang. We have organic evolution, which is the origin of DNA, protein, and the first cell, the first individual life form, the most basic form of life. How did that come to be? We have microevolution, also known as natural selection, survival of the fittest. And this is where the change in our genetic frequency, the mechanism that drives this. And one of the caveats to microevolution is that mutation is the source of all variation. And then macroevolution, also known as speciation, and that's the idea of going from a cell to a multicellular organism to something very complex. Now, you'll see I have in yellow or orange highlighted, these are the parts of evolution that are absolutely true. The rest of these, I believe, are extrapolations, and that's what we're going to discuss throughout the course of this series. So going back to the theological arguments, what we're going to do is to go from an argument for God to an evolutionary argument, back and forth. So we kind of have a balance. And we're going to talk about each one of these and break them down. The cosmological argument is the law of cause and effect. The idea being that a material effect must have an adequate cause that existed prior. So there's a lot of intricacy within that phrase. We need to first understand, what do we mean by an adequate cause? Well, I have an example up here, it's a little bit further down, the pebble that created the tsunami. Now, if we were to throw a pebble into the ocean, well, that is a cause, and it will cause something to happen. It will have an effect, and it will cause ripples in the water when we throw that pebble into the ocean. But we could not reasonably say that the effect of that pebble being thrown into the ocean would cause a tsunami to occur, because that would mean that the effect is greater than the cause, and that cannot be. The cause always has to be at least equal to, if not greater than, the effect that it has. We talked about this little contraption here. I've forgotten the name now again. Newton's cradle, that's right. Thank you, Barry, for helping me out. Newton's cradle. We just looked that up before we began, and already it's left my mind. But Newton's cradle, and you've seen this device where the balls will bounce back and forth. It seemingly for forever. Of course, that's not the case because they eventually will slow down due to friction. But the idea is that we take energy, it has a cause when it hits those other metal balls, and that it will have an effect of the other ball swinging up. Now, one thing you'll never see is that if you drop the first ball only an inch from the rest, you're not going to see the last ball fly up 4 inches, because that would mean the effect is greater than the cause. So that is an impossibility. The cause must always be greater than or equal to the effect. So, let's break down also what the idea of this, the cause and effect, is about. Well, how did this concept originate? Well, the problem is there can never be an eternal regression. That's the biggest problem that was being solved with this idea. We cannot have an eternal regression. And what do we mean by that? Well, if something exists, then something happened before it to cause that to happen, or just say an effect. I'm here today. Something happened to bring me here today. I drove here today. Well, what happened before I drove here today? Well, I was at my home. Where was I before my home? I was somewhere else. So you can always go back and back and back. Something happened before that. Something happened before that that caused the next thing to happen. But what you cannot have is that cannot go on forever. There eventually has to be the first cause. You can't, it's illogical to think that you can just keep walking back and back, the thing that happened before that, the thing that happened before that. It just doesn't work that way. You have to have an original cause. Well, how does that apply to God himself? Does God have to have a cause? Does God fit into this description? If everything that is an effect has to have a cause, and God is, here, he is present, does that not mean that he must have a cause? Well, if we look at the definition here, it says a material effect, a physical effect, things made of, the atoms, the energy, the wavelengths that we find in our physical world. Those things are material, and a material effect must have an adequate cause that existed prior. God is not material. Now, it occurred to me when we were putting this together that says a lot to us. That opens our eyes to a little bit about the nature of God, or at least what God is not. God is not material. God is not, we think of God as being, having a similar appearance perhaps as we do. Or even if not that, if we go a little bit more mystical, we're thinking of some kind of a floating spirit of gas or energy or light, pure light maybe, or pure energy. But all of those things are material. Energy, light, vapors, all these things are physical. They're material, and God is not material. Or else he would have to have had a cause. But God, being the original cause, must or cannot be material. He's not made up of any of those things. So what is God made of? Well, that's beyond our understanding. But he does not consist of what he has created. So that kind of blows our mind, and perhaps it's hard to understand, and it makes us a little uncomfortable not to be able to relate as well to God being not made of things that we can understand. And we do know that the Bible talks about God being a spirit. So the spiritual world even can be referred to, considering they have similar characteristics. Not being made of material things. It just blows your mind when you think about that. But it tells us something interesting about the nature of God. I'll add in here also the teleological argument is very similar to the cosmological argument. While cosmological speaks about material things, material effect must have an adequate cause. This is talking about the origin of consciousness, that consciousness must be preceded by previously existing consciousness. Just as we have children who have consciousness, well, we preceded them, we had consciousness. There always has to be a cause of that came before, that had the effect of consciousness. So it's a similar idea, but rather than the physical, it's talking about that spark of life and that consciousness that we have. So jumping from a theological argument, now looking at evolution. The first breakdown principle of evolution that we discussed was cosmological evolution. So this is talking about the origin of matter, the origin of time, of space, of the universe as a whole. Now, the answer that evolution has to the beginning of everything, what is the cause of everything? Well, we just talked about in the theological argument that there has to be an immaterial cause to the great effect, and it has to be at least as great or greater than that effect. Now, just pause right there for a moment and think back to that picture of all those galaxies. The cause of all of those things has to be greater than, at least equal to, but most likely greater than the effect. The cause has to be greater than the effect. So if the cause of all physical, all material that we can see, measure, the things that we can't see, we can't measure, is greater than, and that has to be God. Imagine just what that says about the nature of the grandeur, the magnificence of God and who He is, how powerful, how it's just mind-blowing to think about that. But the Big Bang, where does this come from? What evidence do they have to support the idea of the Big Bang? So we said there has to be an immaterial cause to be the first cause for the cause and effect. So this is the other explanation, the idea that something came from nothing. This violates the idea of cause and effect, obviously. But the idea that something came from nothing, and this is expressed in the Big Bang. So what is the evidence for the Big Bang? There are two primary pieces of evidence where the whole idea of the Big Bang came from. The first is the observation that the universe is expanding over time. The stars, the galaxies, everything is moving away from each other over time, further and further away, faster and faster. So, first let's think about real quickly, how do they know this? And it's the Doppler effect. And you can kind of Google this or look at it. I explained it a little bit more thoroughly in the first class, but this is the idea of the wavelengths of light, and that when you're moving towards a source of light, moving towards it or moving away from it, that wavelength changes, and as that wavelength, actually the wavelength doesn't change, but our perception of the wavelength changes to be less or more frequent. And you might have heard frequency in light waves can determine the color spectrum. And so there's a range of frequencies of light wave paths that produce different colors. So when something is moving, that's all to say, long story short, if something is moving away from us, it changes color in a predictable way. When something is moving towards us, it changes color in a predictable way. We talk about red shifts and blue shifts. When things move away from us, we see a red shift. It looks like it's moving, the wavelengths are longer than they truly are because of the velocity away from us. It gets very complicated to talk about, but so the idea is that when they observe all the stars, all the galaxies, everything that we can look at, we notice that everything in every direction is moving away from us. So, you can only conclude two things. One, we're the center of the universe, and that's, kind of, it's a funny thought to say, well, the Earth is the center of the universe. It's kind of used as an expression for arrogance. I'm the center of the universe. The other idea is that the fabric of space and time that everything is a part of is all stretching at the same time, like dots on the outside of an expanding balloon. So this is the idea that the universe is expanding over time, the evidence for it. And then the second piece of evidence for the idea of the Big Bang is background radiation. We can measure outside when we send things up into space, and we can take these measurements, we see a great deal of background radiation. And so what does background radiation tell us? It tells us that a lot of energy was released at some point in the past. Something big happened. Well, certainly that's the case. Something big has happened in our universe. It happens all the time, actually. But something truly massive has happened in the past that has caused all this background radiation, and things are moving away from us all the time. So the conclusions that were made from this is that if things are moving away from us over time, that if we go back in time, we can imagine that those things used to be closer. And then if we mix that idea with the idea that something big, a big release of energy has happened in the past, then that's where they say, well, all these things must have been so close together that they were all really one thing, one singularity, one infinitesimal small dot that exploded and created everything we had. Even then, they have a difficulty coming up with the idea of, well, the origin of that infinitesimal little dot. Where did that come from? The idea of something from nothing. And there's been attempts to explain that, but it is really truly beyond explanation. We know something does not come from nothing, but the whole point of this is that this is all the evidence for the Big Bang. And this is actually things that can be explained by creation. The law of conservation of mass suggests that matter cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only change forms. That is a law. That is a scientific law. And yet they claim that something came from nothing. It's a contradiction. We say that matter cannot be created or destroyed, but at one point it was with the Big Bang, right? That's the claim. It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. Also, it's interesting to note in Isaiah and Job, the scriptures that talk about during creation that God stretched forth the heavens. Well, is that not what we see when we look at an expanding universe? We think about background radiation. Well, certainly the events of creation and all the magnificence and the galaxies and all that is energy, and certainly there's some byproduct from that, even in the concept of creation. So Big Bang Theory, for one, is not based on a great deal of evidence, but the interpretation of the evidence, which in and of itself is good, legitimate evidence. But you can use that to contradict yourself and say that something came from nothing, or you can say that this is a product of creation and that we can see this described even in the Bible. So that is the end of our time for this particular class. We did not quite get to where we left off in the second installment back in March, but we will pick up from here. And once we get to new material, I'll slow down a little bit and we'll get in a little bit more detail again. If you missed the first two classes back in March, I would recommend that you go and look at those, that I take a little more time to describe some of these topics and get some questions. This is just kind of a way of review to catch us back up to new material. So thank you so much for being with me tonight, and pray that you have a great evening, and that some of these ideas, the magnificence of God as we see in our universe, will be a source of inspiration for you. So thank you.